So good morning. It's kind of interesting because we start out the semester and we, get into Photoshop and we do it, and then all of a sudden we get to the point where it's like, okay, time to move into InDesign. And then we'll be in InDesign for a little while, and then, okay, time to switch into Illustrator, and then into AutoCAD. And then it starts to move rather quickly. So it's the nature of the class. We have to cover a lot of different things. But I think the biggest thing to remind you at this point is just because we, quote, are done with Photoshop doesn't mean that, let's say today we're doing an album as part of your exercise. Doesn't mean that if you took the photo, you shouldn't take the photo into Photoshop and tweak it and then bring it into InDesign. So it doesn't mean that you can just completely forget everything that we learned in Photoshop, right? That's still relevant to the class. So even though we're not specifically dealing with Photoshop anymore, it's assumed that you will continue to use Photoshop in what you do. Okay? And I like to remind you of that because all too often we just cut and run and you forget about what you learned in Photoshop. We will come back and revisit Photoshop before the end of the class, just like we will come back and revisit almost every program as part of as we go forward. It's just the nature of how this class builds on itself. So we have to move on and start talking about InDesign. So you got two handouts today. One is for assignment 103, which is due on March 9th. So we still have a little bit of time. But I like to give you this as much notice as I can. You're going to be creating an 11 by 17 poster of the architecture lecture series. You can use this semester's projected lecture series. You can use last semester's lecture series, or you can completely make up who's coming to visit. And if you look at the samples, many times people just make up who they think would be good to have come visit. So there's no actual requirements for specific people that need to be coming to the lecture series. It's something that's designed to make people want to come see these people speak. And so certainly if the speakers were big name people, that would probably help. But I've seen it done where students speak and that people have used their friends. And it can be very creative. This is graded not on the content of the poster, but how the poster looks and what the typography is and what the hierarchy that's established and kind of the overall graphic design nature of this particular poster. So we'll cover it a lot more. You do not have anywhere near the skills to do this just yet. So we'll definitely cover it more, but I like to give it to you way in advance so you know what's coming. And in the nature of a class like this, I try to keep it fairly consistent in terms of there's always an assignment kind of. So you turned one in today, you get the next one. I will also apologize to you at this point. It's my goal always to have your grades back on the first assignment by the time you turn in the next assignment. That's usually what I try to do as a policy. I have finished all of the grades on your first assignment, but I haven't gone through and been able to deal with all the exercises yet and make sure that you're caught up. So it's possible that by the end of class today, depending on how many questions you have, I may have grade sheets for you. If not, you'll definitely get them next class. And I apologize. It's just a matter of I'm getting used to there's 60 of 135 instead of 30, and I'm not used to that. So it takes me a little longer to get through it. So I apologize in advance for not getting it to you today, but you will definitely have it next class because that's generally my goal. So we also have a handout for exercise 109, which is doing an album cover, which is actually rather fun. I'll show you and we'll demonstrate InDesign and I'll walk you through how to create this and the techniques that you may need to use to do it. One of the best parts about this is seeing what people pick as their album cover or what artists they pick. So it tends to be kind of fun, but we'll cover that more in a little bit. We're going to start today with the first kind of graphic design based lecture. There will be several more in this vein. These couple up very nicely with what we're doing with InDesign because InDesign is the primary tool for graphic designers to do layouts and do magazines and books and that sort of thing. So it's kind of a natural pairing of the two. But in order to kind of structure what we're doing, I like to frame it in the context of graphic design. So while this is by its nature a class based primarily in architecture, I think we can establish design as a thing that encompasses architecture but also graphic design. And most of the stuff that I talk about today could be equally applied specifically to architecture or specifically to industrial design, or specifically to graphic design. It's kind of design in general, and I think that that makes it very relevant no matter how we talk about it. And so today I'll talk about it in the context of graphic design, but it really it extrapolates very nicely to architectural design as well. So what is the function of design? In the world of graphic design, it's the communication of messages, right, content, through a juxtaposition of words and pictures. So somehow you're trying to get something across to somebody, and you're using both words and pictures to get that information across. Okay? It's the visual synthesis of thought. It's kind of an interesting way of thinking about it, right? You have an idea, you have a thought, and you have to find a way to communicate that idea to somebody else. And so you can't do it verbally in this context. You're doing it in printed form. So our design objectives, right? These kinds of lists, if we sat here and tried to come up with this list, you would come up with a lot of things that are on this list if I were asking you. But basically our objectives in a graphic design sense are guidance maybe, persuasion, right? You're trying to bring somebody to your side of view. You might encourage somebody to go to something or do something, right? You might just be communicating information from some piece of information. You're trying to get that across to somebody else. Maybe you're motivating somebody, right? Maybe you're educating somebody. You're teaching them how to do something, right? Certainly the book or something in this class would be educational. The website would be something that's educational. That has an element of graphic design as well. Maybe you're trying to start up some kind of a dialogue, right? Inspiration, promotion, information. You got to get the general theme of this, right? I don't have to go through each one of these. Right? And juxtaposed with all the text and stuff, I like to try to include a bunch of images as well. These are good examples of portfolio type images, right? Ultimately, the goal of this class is you're going to be creating a portfolio of your work. So seeing examples of portfolio type work is never a bad thing, right? While it's not relevant for your assignment 103, it still is kind of something that we're moving toward as the semester goes on. So sometimes it's nice to see how people put this stuff together. So we want to establish the function of the design, right? And this is essentially, what is the purpose? Why am I doing this in the first place, right? Maybe it's an invitation to a birthday party. Maybe it's a poster, like, in the context of assignment 103, it's the lecture series poster. You're trying to get information across about what this lecture series is. Maybe it's a book, right? What is your primary objective for creating this? Right? Obviously, and I'm going to keep concentrating on assignment 103 because it's something you're going to have to do, but what is the purpose of assignment 103? If you're doing a lecture series poster, the purpose is to get people to go to the lecture, right? So when you think about design, you want to understand what the purpose of that is, right? If we were looking at it from an architectural context, right, what is the purpose of the design? Maybe the purpose of the design is to create a house for a family, right? Maybe the purpose of the design is to create a library to house a certain quantity of books and a certain quantity of patrons that are reading the books, right? So there's an objective to whatever we're trying to do. There is also, in the world of graphic design, an audience, right? Who are you trying to engage with this poster, right? If we're doing an architecture lecture series poster, we're trying to engage people that are interested in architecture, right? But there are probably people on campus that aren't interested in architecture who will safely ignore whatever it is that we're posting. So you want to think about who you're trying to target, right? And obviously a desired reaction. In the case of the lecture series poster, the desired reaction is you'll actually go to the lecture, right? You find it interesting, you go to the lecture. So if you think about those, it can a lot of times frame what you're trying to do, which is important. It's the designer's responsibility to create a strong communicative experience that support the function of design on behalf of the client and for the viewer. So it's kind of a three-part fork here, right? So the function of the design is our goal, our objective, right? On behalf of the client, i.e. the person who's paying for you to do this in the first place, right? Or the person who's sponsoring the event, and for the person who's going to view it or to do something related to it, right? So there's a lot of different factors to keep track of in design. So what are some designer skills, right? Again, this is a list that if we sat around and we tried to brainstorm together, we could come up with almost everything that was on this list without me giving it to you. But sometimes it's nice to kind of see it in its written form. It might be analysis, perception, communication, right? Research, right? Management of something, problem solving. Problem solving, I think, is one of the biggest issues for designers, right? We are problem solvers. We're trained in critical thinking and problem solving, which is part of why I think a degree in architecture is a great degree to have, even if you don't end up practicing architecture, because we think so much about how to think creatively and solve a problem in a new way. And that's a lot of what this degree is about, right? So problem solving is a big one. Visualization, composition, dialogue, organization, etc. Right? So let's talk a little bit about inspiration. What inspires you? You've probably heard the term inspire or inspiration before, right? And chances are, if you're in this class and if you're interested in this field in the first place, you've been inspired by something, right? Usually this doesn't happen in a vacuum. So how do we cultivate this, right? The first thing is to be aware of your surroundings, right? It's so common for people to walk around with blinders on and not pay attention, right? You get tired, you stop sleeping well, right? That's the nature of school. And then all of a sudden you just trudge in, you're half asleep, and you have your coffee, and you just kind of get to class, and you sit there and wait for me to say something, right? But the truth is, the whole walk from here to there, there's different light. Like I was walking up to get the copies today, and it happened to be the time of day where the sunlight was almost perfectly parallel to the ground as it was coming across. And it really highlighted the edges of the concrete, right? The little control joints in the concrete. It was just kind of interesting, right? Maybe it was inspiring to me in a way, right? It made me think about lighting in a little bit different way, right? Those are the kinds of things that happen that if you walk around with your eyes open, you'll like life a lot better, right? So as a designer, it's your job to do that, right? You don't get to just slog your way into work and not think about it. You have to be creative. You have to be designing things. You have to be aware of this kind of stuff. You have to be inspired, okay? So it's a lot about just being aware of your surroundings, right? Generally, you find this inspiration and you transform it into something that you're trying to make, right? You see inspiration and it weaves its way into your architecture project. It weaves its way into your poster, right? And that's a good thing, okay? The other thing is that it's completely different depending on the person experiencing it, right? Robert and I could go to the same architecture lecture and we could come out of it with completely different inspirations, right? I might have been really interested in the brickwork that somebody was doing, and you might have been really interested in the concrete with the metal whatever, right? And so we can experience the same thing and end up with very different inspirations out of it. And that's something that's important to kind of think about. It's not the kind of thing that should be an extra chore to do, right? One of the things that happens so often in this field is that you'll let's say you move on and you're at Berkeley or Cal Poly and you're living your life in Worcester Hall, which is the architecture building at Berkeley, and you have roommates and they're not architecture majors, right? And they're like, we never see you, right? How could you possibly pick a major where you have to do all this time, okay? And you're always at studio, right? My answer to that, when my roommates used to come and say that, was, I get to build models and draw all day. You have to read books and write papers. Which would you rather do, right? I'm very happy with my life. So you have to think about this in the same context, right? If you're in this field, you should love to do it. That's the best part about it, right? If you're not in this field and it's not interested to you and you don't want to worry about walking around with your eyes open and looking at how the concrete comes down and touches the brick along that edge or something like that, pick something else to do. Don't do this, right? But if you like it, it's not a chore. It makes life a joy, right? It comes from a desire to create and also a desire to communicate. And so this is kind of an interesting thing to think about, because some people don't like to verbally communicate, or they struggle with verbal communications, or they're shy or something like that, but they love to try to communicate through their drawings. And one of the great things about architecture is many times you can communicate more by drawing than you can actually by verbally trying to talk about it, right? Some people are great at talking and they can communicate their ideas by talking, and then you actually see their drawings and they're not really that great, right? So sometimes it works the opposite. So it's about communication, no matter how you slice it, okay? Don't forget to look inward and tap your own creative inspiration. Sometimes people just like to paint or draw or shoot photos or whatever it is that you like to do. Don't forget to do that as part of your own inspiration. Okay? So you want to collect things into your sketchbook. And how many people keep a sketchbook actively right now? Right? it's always amazing to me that more of you don't, right? That's great that you do if you do, okay? But one of the things about a sketchbook, especially when you're in a design field, is you need a place to put your ideas. And your ideas don't always happen in a way that you can just draw them into your sketchbook, but a lot of times if you take time and actually cut things out or tape napkins in or whatever, a little bit later on in the semester I'll show you some photos of some of my sketchbooks where I just collected things. It was like, oh, I like this drawing, I'll put that in here. Oh, I like this, I'll stick that in there. And it kind of becomes this conglomeration of stuff that is your little design collection. And that can really help. I would encourage all of you to start keeping a sketchbook because it will help get your ideas out. Especially when you get into 121, 220, you need that because you never know when you're going to wake up in the middle of the night and have an idea and you need to draw it right then. Right? So you just like, this little sketchbook becomes part of you. It's like always attached to you somewhere. Right? That's important. Okay? You want to write notes, make drawings, take photographs. Those are kinds of things that will help remind you of the things that you're inspired about. So how do you nurture this inspiration? How do you not get stuck? Right? And all too often, you're getting ready for your 121 project and you're trying to do, what are you guys doing, the folding planes thing now or something like that, right? And you're like, oh, I just don't know what to do anymore, right? I'm stuck, right? In the design field, you never want to be stuck, right? So if you're stuck, it means you need inspiration. So we need to figure out how to get you that inspiration. So what do? Right? Well, obviously, if you're carrying a notebook or a camera and you start drawing in that, a lot of times you'll go back and look at something you did 2 days ago, and that'll help get you forward. Right? If you become really immersed in this field and you're around people that do this, it will help you a lot. Right? The more you collaborate, the more you talk to people who are like-minded and interested in what you're doing, the easier it is to not get stuck. Right? And they'll throw some idea and some obscure comment that somebody said. Right? Rebecca said something to me about, whatever. All of a sudden that pops into my head and boom, right? I'm moving on. I'm moving forward. I'm not stuck, right? You want to communicate with other designers, which I was talking about. Sometimes you just need fresh air, right? We in this field love to spend hours and hours and hours working at our desks or staring at our computers. And all too often when we do that, we can get stuck just because we're burnt out, right? I remember in grad school sitting down for a modeling session and not moving for 16 straight hours, not even going to the bathroom, right? Because I was so focused, I had headphones on and I was just doing my thing. But that is very, very tiring, right? It might not be outrunning a marathon tiring, but it's mentally tiring and it's physically tiring because you're in the same spot constantly. Right? The other thing that happens is you'll be working on your computer, and staring at it, and your eyes will start to get tired. Anybody had this happen before? And you just can't see it anymore. Okay? One of the tricks to solving that problem is to every once in a while, every 10 minutes or so, look up and just stare around the room and let your eyes focus on things that are far away. Right? So you don't get just too in the zone and then you get worn out. Okay? So take a walk. Right? Listening to music's a great way of inspiring yourself or motivating yourself. You have to figure out what music actually works. Some music does work, some music doesn't work, right? And it's a personal thing, right? If we were comparing notes on which music worked, something that might work for me might not work for you, right? I know for me personally, if I was modeling, like if I was in grad school modeling during one of those 16-hour sessions, I was always listening to the Symphony of Metallica album. Go figure, right? I haven't listened to it since. But that was the album that I listened to because that made me inspired and that caused me to be productive, right? When I wrote my thesis over and over again, I listened to the soundtrack of the Pirates of the Caribbean. Go figure. Again, I haven't listened to it since. But for whatever reason, that helped me work, right? So if you find whatever that strange little nugget is, no matter how obscure it is, that's a great thing about iPods and headphones and all that stuff is nobody else has to listen to it. Right? But if Taylor Swift is the thing for you and that somehow makes you inspired, then headphones on, listen to it. Okay? And so it's going to depend. It's going to depend on who you are and what your personal tastes are as to what works. But commit to exploring that because it will help you. Right? The other thing that you can do is you can attend lectures. Right? We put on a lecture series here at DVC, or I shouldn't say we. The ACE Club puts on a lecture series where they invite visiting architects to come and speak to you, right? Sometimes the visiting architects come and they're completely boring, right? And you're not inspired. most of the time they have something interesting to say, and you will be inspired. Right? There's also a lecture series that's offered by Berkeley that's open to the public. So if you get really into it, Berkeley tends to draw slightly bigger names than we do here. So you might get to go see like a Tom Main or something like that. And that can be very interesting. Right? And you see somebody else's perspective. So when you're seeing and interacting with, right, somebody that's in the field that you're interested in, you'll be more inspired. You'll see stuff that you can emulate or work on. Right? And don't be afraid to try something new. Sometimes that happens and can help as well. Inspiration is always the first step toward the final design. Right? There's always that moment where you kind of know, I can do this. Right? And that comes from this inspiration. I don't know, I just find that amusing. So let's talk about the design process. And this design process that I'm talking about is very specific to graphic design. However, it has big similarities to design in general. So we're going to talk about graphic design, but remember this can extrapolate very, very easily to architectural design. Okay? So we start with research, then we get to information gathering, right? Then we get to brainstorming, then we get to conceptualization, which is really the first stage of actually designing something. Then we get to experimentation. This is where you're trying lots of different things and failing miserably on a lot of them. That's the nature of design. Right? Then we get into design development, where we have an idea and we're making it better. And then we end up with the final execution of the design. Right? Which is kind of sad because when you're done with the final execution, you always look back and wish you could have done something different. That's also the nature of design. So let's talk about these in a little bit more detail. So number one, you can't skip steps. Right? If you try to skip a step, it won't work. Right? This is the kind of thing that happens in a design studio where you'll have a little bit of inspiration. You'll stay up all night over the weekend, and you're like, I've got it. This is my final project. It's perfect. Right? Well, you haven't given it enough time for your ideas to mature, so there's no way that it can be your actual final product. Right? It needs further evolution. Design is a process, right? Not an end goal. And that's the nature of what we're doing. Right? You can't focus on the final product. Right? If you're always thinking about what the end is going to look like, the process won't help you get there. Right? So think about the process. It's an evolution. You have to keep doing to get there. Right? Every step needs to have your full attention. Right? This is the kind of thing where you're taking a shower, you're thinking about it. Right? You're driving in the car to school, you're thinking about it. Right? You're waiting for your class to start, you're thinking about it. Right? I'm lecturing and I'm boring, you're thinking about it. Right? That happens as part of this design process. You should be obsessively thinking about whatever it is that you're designing. That's the nature of it, and that's what makes it fun. Right? It's totally, unbelievably exhausting to be a designer. Right? And you guys are probably feeling this to some extent as you're in 121 or whatever. But at the same time, it's one of the most rewarding things that you can possibly do because you're actually creating stuff. Right? So, the project brief, or the program, in the architecture context. This is the initial beginning of the design process. This is where we start. And it could start architecturally in school, where we hand you a program of, you're going to be designing a house for these people, or you're going to be designing, a theater complex, a repertory theater, right? Or you're going to be designing the Mondrian Museum, or whatever. You're given something with certain parameters, right? It's supposed to be a meticulous overview of the project and the requirements for the project, whatever that is. Okay? Many times it's not. And that's because whoever wrote it forgot about some stuff. Right? And that's the nature of clients, is they tend to forget about some of the things that they meant to tell you, and that comes later. Right? It should address every detail, every design in detail, every problem in detail. These are the things you need to solve. Right? And maybe the client didn't give you everything that you need to solve, but you need to come up with the list of the things that you do in fact need to solve. Right? It's also going to define the roles of the designer. What are your responsibilities? What are the responsibilities of the person who's paying you to do this work? Right? And who is the viewer going to be? Right? Who is this for, ultimately? You're going to begin with the information that's given to you from the client. Right? Like I said, in an ideal world, the client's going to say, this is exactly what I want. Right? But it almost never happens. Right? You need to read through what the client's given you, have a conversation with the client, right? And then you need to clarify and simplify that down into, these are the real problems. right? So there's the problems that the client thinks he has, and then you distill it down into this is what really needs to be solved, right? Because a lot of times the things that he's talking about can end up being simplified a bit, right, into something. You're also responsible to ask questions and to fill in the missing pieces. The worst thing that you can do as a designer is to do something that isn't within the intention of the person who's actually asking you to do the work, right? And so let's say that somebody engages you to design a house, right? And you're like, great, I got this. I love designing houses. And you say, okay, it needs to be a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house or whatever, and you go off and without talking to the client, you design a house. And it ends up being a beautiful modernist house, right? And you come back and you show the client and they say, well, wait a minute, right? I don't like modernist houses. I want a craftsman house, right? Well, you spent all this work and all this money designing something, but you didn't clarify with the client what they actually wanted, right? And so it's your job as a designer to understand that person and to understand what it is that they want. You don't just get free reign. Right? That's the problem with somebody has to pay the bills, right? They get to be in charge. So you want to define the primary goals and the messages to be expressed, right? So if we're doing the lecture series poster, what is the primary goal? Number 1, get people to go to the lecture, right? What are the messages to be expressed? These are the people lecturing. These are the dates that they're being lectured, or that the lecturers are coming, and these are the times that you should be there, and this is where that you should be, right? So you're defining all of that. Right? It's also a good time to define whatever the restrictions might be, the budget, right? Oh, well, we can't afford to make color posters, so it has to be in black and white, right? That would be a good time to know that, because when you're designing, you want to think about that, right? We can't afford to, to do a house that is, that has all the highest end finishes. We need to be on a budget. We need to think about costs, right? Those kinds of things matter, okay? You also want to define kind of a timetable for when you think you can be complete. And this is hard as a designer because it always takes longer than you think it will, right? But you need some kind of, and sometimes it's a finite deadline. The poster has to be up before the lecture happens, right? That would be the nature of it. Hopefully a week before the lecture happened, right? Maybe if you're designing an architectural, there's a hearing that you have to meet. You have to be there, you have to submit it so that the city can review it before your hearing date or whatever. Sometimes there's a hard date and you have to be ready for that. You want to define the audience, and sometimes the audience is the client, right? The person that's engaging you to do the design work, you're designing it for them. Other times you're designing it on behalf of these people for somebody else, right? So in the lecture series example, you're designing the poster on behalf of, let's say, the ACE Club, right? For all the people that might come to the lecture. So there's different roles. So you want to go and you want to gather information, right? It might be text-based information. It might be who the lecturers are and that kind of stuff. But it also might be images, backgrounds, right? Other things that might be relevant to this poster that you're trying to make. You're trying to pull it all in so you have all the pieces and then you can start to think about it, right? If anything is missing, you have to request it from the client. Right? And I think one of the big problems with graphic design is a lot of times who's responsible for the actual content, right? And so the graphic designers are generally responsible for how the content is portrayed, not writing the content, right? There's some kind of a writer or somebody who's actually going to create the verbiage that's going to go as part of the poster, right? In your context for this, you happen to have to create the list of lecturers. I'm not going to give it to you. But I give you a variety of sources that you can pull from. Okay? If anything's missing, you have to request it from whoever should provide it to you. Then we get into the research phase. And I would say that this is one of the more interesting things about the world of design that is kind of a side benefit. And that is that in order for you to design something, you have to become very, very familiar with that industry or that particular thing, right? So let's say somebody asked you to design a zoo, okay? Well, you'd have to learn everything there is to know about a zoo in order to design a good zoo, right? Then the next day you might get another client who comes in and says, I want you to design a library. Well, you learned all this cool information about a zoo, but the information about the zoo and how the elephants feed and where their poop goes after they poop doesn't necessarily play into designing a library and where the books go, right? They're two very separate things, but you as a designer are this common thread that runs across all of these various industries, and you get to research all this stuff and learn a ton about, right, a library, and then a zoo, and then a whatever else, an archive, and then a house, and how people live in a house, or a school, and what the classrooms are like. There's so much to learn in the design field, and sure, if you start to work for a firm tends to have a specialty, and they tend to do certain things over and over again because they're really good at them. But one of the exciting things about design is you get to learn about a lot of different things, and you get to be inspired by a lot of different things, right? You'll also learn that you really don't like designing libraries and you really do like designing houses, or vice versa, right? There are things that you like and things that you don't like. But as a designer, you're designing whatever the client wants, right? So you get to do all this research, which is really fun, right? You, in the graphic design sense, you also want to review whatever the current materials are that are out there. So for example, in the lecture series poster, it'd be pretty good to go back and look at old lecture series posters. See the kinds of things that are given out, the information that's given out, and that can play a role in what you choose to show as well, right? Brainstorming is this, it's a little bit harder in design than, say, brainstorming ideas for your history research paper, right, which is a little bit more like controlled. Design is, in brainstorming, is you're just throwing out ideas and trying to figure out what sticks, right? And sometimes there's a lot of really random stuff that comes out, and then all of a sudden it'll start to gel together and become something, right? So this is a lot of times writing down lists, doing little mini sketches, and thinking about how these pieces come together. Sometimes you start with just one little detail about how a corner comes together, or what a particular font is going to look like on a poster, or what combination of fonts are you going to use, long before you get to the bigger picture of who's actually lecturing. So then you get into the conceptualization phase, right? This is when you get into the thematic link between the design, the function, and the delivery of that design, right? So this is when it really starts to come together and you start to produce something that's real, as opposed to a bunch of random sketches that are part of your brainstorming. You're starting to get into the actual experimentation phase where you try stuff out, right? You try different colors, you try different typesets, you try different compositions, right? And all of those various things. I had a student who did a poster. Actually, I think it's on the handout. The one on the right of your handout, this one with the building on it, right? This was, I think, iteration 10 of his posters, right? He tried 10 different posters with the same elements, the same building, the same stuff, before he settled on this as being the right poster, right? So sometimes it takes this iterative process of trying and trying and trying, and then figuring out what's working on one and what's not working on another, okay? You vary the sequence. You try something new. You flip everything upside down. I mean, you guys will go into, and you may have experienced with this, your folding 121 project. How many people are in 121 right now? A lot of you, right? Okay, so you're doing that folding planes thing, right? You came in and you showed it to Daniel, or you showed it to Marlon, right? And they said, well, what if you did this? And they flipped it over, or they folded something different, right? Something along those lines. That's part of this trying something new, right? You get focused in on making one particular thing, and you forget to try stuff out and change stuff, right? And that's a big part of the design process. Then we get down to the execution phase. This is where we're starting to cull and distill out the stuff that's working and the stuff that isn't, and really trying to focus down into one project, right? You have to really think about every detail. The best designers out there can think about the very large-scale picture stuff, right? What is the form of the overall building, or the form of the overall poster? And then what's the difference between the kerning and the tracking in an individual letter? Or how does the corner come down? Is it beveled? Is it not beveled? How does it meet the ground? Those kinds of very fine details. The best designers can do both at the same time. And you will learn as you pursue this career in design that you have to learn to think about big scale, small scale, all at the same time, right? And it takes practice. So the other thing I like to bring up here is that you want to divorce from attachment at this stage. And you may have experienced a little bit of this in your folding planes exercise that you've been working on. in that you make something and you think it's this precious object because you spend hours and hours and hours creating it, right? And it's only human nature. There's nothing wrong with that, right? It's just the way we work, right? We get very possessive of, this is my design, this is my idea, and who are you to make me want to change it, right? But the truth is that you can only push your design further by relaxing that control over it, right? So instead of cringing when Daniel says, what if you flip this upside down, or what if you cut this piece off, right? Go with it, right? See what happens when that happens, because a lot of times it will make your overall design that much better. You're learning from it rather than shutting down because you're afraid somebody's wrecking what you created, okay? You want to go back and analyze objectively. Did I meet the goals that I was trying to meet? Did I solve the problems that I was trying to solve, right? Go back, reread that project brief. Did you actually solve what you were trying to do? Right? That's important. And then you produce the final draft. Right? This is when you get into production mode of, this is what this thing is really going to be. So then let's talk about something called intuition. Right? And this is probably the hardest thing to explain and the hardest thing to get initially. And you as young designers have a really hard time trusting that this is okay. Okay? So you can learn all the fundamentals you want, right? In this excuse me. In this class, I teach you skill after skill after skill. How to work with this particular piece of software, how to add shadows to a collaged image, right? All of those things are just skills, right? Skills are something that computers can do, right? It's a basic set of steps that you go through and it's done. Okay? Really learning how to design takes the assembly of those things and then the creativity to make it happen. So good comprehension of techniques does not equal good design. Right? And that's something that's really important to understand. So you can be the best possible person at creating renderings, and it doesn't mean that your projects are good. Right? And you can get away with a lot, you can fake a lot, but it doesn't really mean that you're a good designer. So how we're talking about this intuition thing, and how does that play into it? Okay? Intuition is kind of like the inner voice that says, this is a good idea or this is a bad idea. Right? It's that little person that stands on your shoulder and says, yeah, you can do this, or no, that's not a good idea. Right? And it's something that is a different level of thinking. Right? It's not a rational thought process. It's not something that you can logic through and say, oh, this is good because of this, right? It's a gut feeling, right? And all too often you go into a review and there's some reviewers that are going to look at your project, and maybe you've had this experience, maybe you haven't, and the reviewers will sit there and they'll go, this just doesn't quite feel right. Anybody have something like that happen before, right? Where they're like, yeah, there's something just not quite right about it, or this really feels pretty good, right? And you'll hear that almost exact phrase in reviews in the architecture world rather frequently. And what that person is referring to, the reviewer, is their intuition, right? It feels right or it feels wrong, right? Has to do with a gut reaction to this particular design, right? So you have to learn to have that and to trust it, okay? It comes very naturally. You can't force it, because as soon as you try to force it, it's rational thought, not just, this is the in the middle of the night it feels right when you wake up from sound sleep, right? You're not really thinking, it just feels right, okay? It allows you to have thoughts that wouldn't come out of a rational thought process. It's a lot of times where the thinking outside the box, right? It's not really thinking, it's like some gut idea that's out there that says, yeah, this is a good idea, go for it, okay? It's guidance, certainly. It's protection. Ooh, you better not do that, right? You've probably had that voice before, right? It might be inspiration. Try this, try this, try this, right? It might be the aha moment. I get it now, right? That might come too. And it might be some form of synthesis, right? This is really a cultivation of your imagination, right? It allows you to move beyond whatever your comfort zone is. And all too often in the design field, we're constantly pushing for moving beyond what is your natural comfort zone, right? This is what I'm comfortable doing. Push it further, right? Go for it. Take that risk. That's part of what makes really great design, right? I can tell you right now that the best designers out there didn't stay within their comfort zone. They pushed the boundaries, and that's the nature of good designers, okay? It often leads to fresh and innovative solutions. Something that you didn't think of before, right, is now coming out. It increases the number of ideas that you have, right? And it can a lot of times provide that little bit of spark that pushes you that last step, right, when you're really starting to feel stuck. You have to also allow that intuition out, right? Sometimes with designers, and especially early in this, they don't want to trust their intuition. They think that the professor is going to like something, so they do it because of that, even though their intuition is saying, it's not going to look very good, right? Or it's not going to turn out, right? Remember to trust yourself in this, right? It takes a lot of time to believe that your instincts or your intuition is actually accurate and correct, right? You have to learn to trust it, and that takes time, right? Also, don't prejudge or abandon without actually letting the idea mature, right? So sometimes your intuition says, take this leap, and you go, oh no, I'm not doing that, right? I don't want to sacrifice my grade. I don't want to take that leap, right? It's hard to take that leap, but if you do, most of the time your design will be better. So in this particular class, let's use my class as an example, and you of course have to judge who the instructor is in a particular class, because let's all be honest, at your stage in your careers, your grades really matter, right? How many people care about what grade they get in this class, right? I'd be scared if all of you didn't raise your hand, right? It's natural to care about your grades, right? By the time you get to grad school and you're getting a grade on your thesis, you're kind of like, I don't really care anymore. It doesn't matter, right? But right now, your grades matter. Your GPA matters for transferring and all that stuff. So you as designers that are learning this are trying to weigh, do I take this risk and potentially fail the class because I took this risk, right? Or do I do something safe that I'll probably, I'll end up with a B and I'll be okay, right? All too often, you guys as young designers take the route where I'll take the B, that works, right? And you don't really take that leap, okay? In this class, you will always be rewarded for taking the leap. Okay? The other thing is I have a safety net underneath you, so if you take the leap and you fail miserably, you can always resubmit your work, right? So I set that up on purpose so that you guys can feel free to take that leap and to push the boundaries of what's possible, right? And I encourage you to do that. And you've got the safety net. So if you fail, you're not really going to fail the class, right? Which is the idea, okay? Now, some people, right, in some classes don't give you the safety net. And if you don't have the safety net, it's a lot harder to take the leap. But I can tell you right now from experience, the best work that you will do is when you take that leap, when you trust your intuition and you take that leap. Okay? So the other thing is your intuition might not always be that useful, right? Sometimes it might be telling you to do something and you're like, it doesn't really fit with what I'm trying to do. And you have to let it mature, you have to try it out, and then you say, yeah, it didn't really work, right? That happens. Right? Hopefully you don't get to that point at the end of the project. You get to that at the beginning of the project and you can correct it. Right? So if you're going to nurture your intuition, don't be afraid to take risks. We've been talking about that. Listen and react to that inner voice, that thing that's saying, yeah, it looks good. Yeah, it looks good. Or, no, it doesn't look that good yet. All right, better keep trying. Right? Expect the unexpected to happen. That's part of this. Okay? Don't overanalyze, right? Remember, intuition is the complement to rational thought. So you have one side of your brain that's all about rational thought and thinking about this is going to work and all of that stuff. And then the other is it's a gut feeling about it looks good, it doesn't look good, it feels right, it doesn't feel right, right? So you need those two to work together, right? Record your thoughts and collect visuals. We talked a lot about inspiration earlier. That also helps, right? So elevate. So I think this quote, and I'm going to end on this quote, and then we'll talk about InDesign. I think this is probably the best way of describing this kind of intuition. In this design process, there are things that you think about rationally, those that you learn about, and those that you're looking for. And then there's the most interesting part that you cannot be rational about. You just feel it for some strange reason, right? If you feel right, it will fit into your design perfectly, or concept perfectly, and it'll make it more interesting and unique, right? So this is that other little piece that's just about feeling it, right? And it's probably the hardest part of design or learning to design is cultivating this piece of it. Okay? But that's part of why you go to school for as long as you do. I mean, architecture people go to school as long as doctors do. Right? So if you compare, it must mean that architecture is hard. Right? It's hard to be a good designer. And that's okay. Right? And you get to build models all the time, which is awesome. Right? And draw. Anyway, so let's move over into the world of InDesign. I'm going to walk you through InDesign, and then we'll create our first little project. Okay, so we're going to work with exercise 109 today, and that is really starting to work with Adobe InDesign for the first time. How many people have opened InDesign before? Right? A lot of you in 121 were suddenly dropped into, guess what, make a poster, right? And so you've been trying to figure it out. So my guess is you already have some of the quirks figured out. Hopefully, my instruction in InDesign will help clarify some of the more challenging issues. So I'm going to go ahead and open up InDesign. It's available under all programs, Adobe Creative Suite, or excuse me, Adobe Design Standard CS6, and then Adobe InDesign CS6. Now, in the world of Photoshop, Photoshop files are backwards compatible very nicely. So if you have Creative Cloud at home or on your laptop, the newest version of Photoshop, and you save your file and you come in here, you can open it. Right? Doesn't present a particular big problem. If you have Creative Cloud on your laptop or at home and you work in InDesign, you cannot open it on the school computers. Okay? So you have to be aware of that fact. There is a workaround in that you can save your Creative Cloud version as a file that's called an IDML file, in which case you can go back and open it here. It's just something to be aware of. Right? So if you're feeling like you're working in Creative Cloud, don't just save your INDD file and bring it into school and expect that it's going to work, right? And I like to warn people ahead of time that InDesign is particularly nasty when it comes to backwards compatibility. Okay? So if you're in that boat, I can help you through with the IDML file so that you get comfortable with it, or you could just bring your laptop if it's on your laptop and you're working in that. Okay? So this is Adobe InDesign. When we first open Adobe InDesign, there's a little splash screen that pops up that gets us easy access to creating a new document. Today we're going to actually create a new document, so I'm going to go ahead and click on Document right here. And it brings up this new document little dialog box that lets me specify things about my particular new document. Okay? So under Document Preset, there really aren't any presets. If I had this saved on my computer and I did certain documents over and over again, if I was a graphic designer and I did a lot of posters, I might have some presets for how I like my posters to turn out. But for our purposes, we're just leaving it as default. Intent has to do with what the ultimate goal of what we're doing is going to be. Right? Generally speaking, print is what we want. Right? If we're making a poster, the end goal would that it would be printed. Okay? So I'm going to leave it set as print. We have the ability to change the number of pages that we start with, right? And we can also change the starting page number. This would be if you're creating like a booklet or a portfolio or something. Today we're not creating anything, so we just need one page. Right? Next to it, we have a little checkbox for something called facing pages. And facing pages is like a book. We open it, and there's a left page and a right page. Right? There's content on the left page, there's content on the right page. Okay? For what we're doing today, it isn't facing pages. We're just doing a single album cover, so we're going to uncheck the box for facing pages. Okay? All of these settings, by the way, are available. You can go back and do them after you've created the document. So if you made a mistake and you really wanted it to be facing pages, you can turn that back on. Right? Or you didn't uncheck it and they were facing pages and you didn't want it to be, you can go back and turn it off. Right? Okay, so then we come down here to page size. It's set as default at letter. We're going to change it down here to compact disc, right? Which is a CD-sized image, right? Which is what we're doing because we're doing album art, right? We could change the orientation from portrait to landscape if we wanted to. This is a square, so it doesn't make any difference whether we change it, right? And then we can preset a number of columns, and we can also preset the margins on the page, right? Because I don't need there to be any margins on this, I'm going to go ahead and change the value here at top to be 0. And if I hit the Tab key, because this little chain button is selected, right, it'll go to 0 in all fields. Okay? The other thing is you've noticed that the units here are rather weird, right? 0p0 in this context, or up here the size is 28p4.157, right? This is actually something called picas, which is a graphic design layout unit. It means nothing to me, right? I have no idea what size that is, right? So we will change the units after in just a second, but this is the default. If, however, I wanted to specify, let me switch from compact disc to tabloid, for example. See, we get some random number of picas, right? I could, however, in this box, type 11 IN for inches, and then 17 space IN, and it would convert the numbers for me, right? So I can use another unit if I wanted to specify it. Anyway, I'm going to go back to a compact disc. And then I'll go ahead and say OK. And it will create my new document. Okay? So let's go ahead and look at the world of InDesign a little bit, at what tools we have available. It looks like this was not docked. I like it docked. There we go. So in InDesign, this looks an awful lot like Photoshop, right? Or it should. It's an Adobe product. They should be similar. Okay? So right here across the top, we have our normal set of menus, right? A file, save, all that kind of stuff. Very, very similar to Photoshop. A few differences. We have a type menu, a layout menu, and an object menu. We'll talk about what those are as we go forward. Below this, sorry, let me get off, we have a ribbon that runs across the top. That is a contextually aware ribbon, so depending on which tool we're using, we'll have different options available up at the top here. So that's going to change. For example, if I went to the pen tool, or maybe frame tool, well, it's not changing much. Let me go to the type tool, then it'll change it. There you go. Type tool gives me a bunch of different options for type. So it's important to just be aware that it changes depending on what you have selected. Okay? On the left side here, we have our standard set of tools that are available, much like Photoshop, but an entirely different set of tools, right? That we'll work with a little bit more in depth today. We also have something that's always behind my head right here, right? That has a red slash in it, and then there's a kind of an outline. Those are two different colors. It's called a fill color and a stroke color, right? The fill color is the body color, and the stroke color is the outline color. And so we can specify on any object our fill color and our outline as two independent things. The red slash means it's transparent. So in this case, if I were to draw something, it would be a black outline with a clear center. Okay? But I can change that into anything that I want. Okay? We have a set of rulers that's been set up. And again, these rulers are in a unit called picas, right? I want to change these into inches so that I can actually see and understand what I'm looking at. And I can do that by right-clicking where the two rulers meet, and I can switch from picas to inches. And now it looks like inches. Now notice that 0 starts at the corner of my document, not over here somewhere. Okay? So it goes forward from 0 this direction, and it goes backward from 0 from there. Same thing happens right here. It goes 0 negative and 0 positive from that upper corner of my drawing. Okay? Just like in Photoshop, I can drag a guide down into my workspace from the rulers, right? And I can also get rid of that guide by clicking on it and pressing the delete key. On the right side, over here, right, we have a couple things. Way up at the top, there's something that's called advanced. It may say essentials in yours. I don't know which one. Does it say essentials? This is a different, what's called a workspace. And so I can switch into essentials mode, or I can switch into advanced mode, and it gives me different options available on the right side here. Right? I could also, if I was working on typography, I could switch into typography mode, and it gives me different options available. Okay? For today, I apologize that mine was set as advanced. We'll go into just essentials. That's all you need. Okay? And over here on the right side, right, I have these various windows that are available to me. The first one is pages. And if I click on that, we see that I have one page. It's highlighted in blue here. That's the page I'm going to be working on. Right? Above this is something called a master. We'll talk about this a little bit later on in the class. Okay? Not today, a couple days from now. Below that, I have layers. Layers are like Photoshop layers. Layers that are on top of other layers. Objects that are on that layer will be on top of the objects that are below it. The difference between Photoshop and InDesign is generally in Photoshop you have one object per layer. Right? So you have one thing that you placed, it becomes one layer. Okay? In InDesign, you can have multiple objects on each layer. So it's a little bit different. Okay? And we'll talk about that in more depth. The next window down here is called links. And this brings up something that's very, very important about InDesign and how InDesign works. So InDesign is built to make large posters. It's made to make 100-page books. Right? If you go and I actually had a friend who worked for Money Magazine in New York, and I visited her in her office, and guess what? All the layout work that was done in Money Magazine was done with InDesign. Right? So this is very much a professional piece of software. The thing about it is, since we're dealing with large objects potentially, big posters, multi-page books with lots and lots of images in them, right? Instead of embedding every single image into the file, right? InDesign works by linking one file to another. So when I bring an image into InDesign, I'm not actually bringing the full-size image in. I'm bringing a reference to, here's my original image, it's saved here on my flash drive, and I'll show a preview of what it looks like. Now when InDesign goes and prints, or when it creates a PDF as its end product, or a JPEG, or whatever, it will go to that referenced file, pull in the full resolution version, and assemble it. Okay? So, because it's a linked setup, right, we have to keep track of the original files and where they go. Okay? And that's where this links menu comes in handy. Right? So if we lose an original file, we might have to relink it to where the original file is. We might have to go find the original file. Right? And so that's where this links things come in. If you're having problems, you'll get these little triangles with exclamation marks next to individual images. That means they're not linked anymore. Okay, below that, we have something called stroke. This has to do with the properties of a line. So if I had a line, I could make it a different thickness. I could change the starting or ending to have an arrow or whatever. Okay, we're not going to deal too much with that. Below that, I have colors. This is basically a color picker. Because this is a print version, the color space is CMYK, which has to do with the easiest way to think of it is toner in a laser printer. Right? Those are the 4 toners that are available in a color laser printer: cyan, magenta, yellow, and key, which is black. So any color that you create is a combination of those colors. Right? And we'll talk about color space and color a little bit later on in the class. Okay? Below that, I have a window called swatches. This is if I were saving particular colors to use over and over again. Okay? So essentially, we've worked our way through the bulk of this program. Now it's about how do we work with this program. Okay? So I asked you today to create an album cover. Right? So you can pick a band and create your album cover. Again, it's entirely up to you as to who you pick, right? Or what you want to do. You can use your own images, or you can find images online. I'm going to use a Creative Commons search, and I'll do something for, I don't know, like maybe Luke Bryan or some country artist, Garth Brooks, something like that. Let's do Garth Brooks, right? Most of you are like, who on earth is he, right? But hey, whatever, right? A few people that are older in the room might know who Garth Brooks is, right? By the way, this is a total side note. Best concert I've ever been to was Garth Brooks, hands down. He beat everybody. He was just incredible. It was in California. Anyway, so let's say that I wanted to do something. I don't know. Let's do a farm. Whatever, right? We'll stick with the country theme for now. Okay. So I'll look through and I'll say, oh, that looks kind of interesting, right? Maybe I'll pick that one, right? Kind of tractor-esque, right? Kind of a unique look. So let me go ahead and download that. I'll download the original file. Now, I want to pay attention to where I put this file. So let me go ahead and copy this, and I'm going to put it on my flash drive. But I'm going to be careful with where I place it. Notice I'm not leaving it on the desktop or somewhere else. When we start to get into InDesign, it's absolutely critical that you keep your flash drive and not work off the desktop, because those links are going to get messed up. Okay? You can of course always relink, but it's nice if they're clean when you go to open it. So let me go ahead and create an exercise 109 folder. Exercise 109, and I'll go ahead and paste this image into the folder. Okay? So now I'll go back to InDesign. And so unlike Photoshop, where we went to either File Open or we might have copied, we're going to do File Place. And you may have done Place in Photoshop as well, right? Place means that it's a referenced file. So I'll go to File and then Place, and I can drop my image into the scene. So there it is. And we see that my cursor now has a little preview of the image. Yeah.
Since we have not been working, we go open.
Because we already have our InDesign file. The file already exists. Now we're going and bringing images in. Right? This is if I were to save this, it would just show up as a white box, but the file already exists. Okay? So wherever I click, it will drop the image in. Now notice that this image is really, really big, right, in comparison. And so it would take a lot of work to find and to make this image fit onto my screen. Okay? So instead of doing it in that order, right, I am instead going to start with the graphic layout, and then I'll bring the images in. So I'm going to come over here on my left-hand side where my tools are, and I'm going to go to something called a rectangular frame. Okay? It's a rectangle with an X in it. Okay? And when I click on this, right, and I draw on my screen, I'm going to draw the size of my document here. I get a blue box with an X in it. Right? This represents a placeholder, right, or a place where I can put something. Right? Now, in today's world, we're going to talk about putting an image into this frame, but this would work just the same if I put text into the frame. Right? It's just an empty space that I can put something. So now that I have the frame created, I'm going to go ahead and go to File, or if I have nothing selected before I go to File Place, I have to actually select the frame. And when I select the frame, I get the little grips on the sides, which means I know it's selected. Now I'll go up and I'll go to File and then Place. And I'll pick my image again, and I'll say Open. And notice that the image didn't go past the border of my frame. It went inside the frame. Right? It still doesn't really fit yet. Okay? So I'd like it to fit. I could go in and I could edit the image and I could scale it down or whatever. But instead of that, all I have to do is right-click on the frame, or in this case on the image, and I can go to a menu that's called Fitting. Right? And what fitting does is it gives me a variety of options. So I've got the ability to fill the frame proportionally, or I can fit the content proportionally. And I'll show you what each of these do. Right? And then I come down here to fit frame to content or fit content to frame. Right? I can center the content. Let's start with centering the content. Okay? So same size, but now the image is centered on this content. Okay? Now, if I go back to fitting, there's key words. Proportionally means that it's not going to squish or stretch the image at all. Right? Content or frame down here means it's going to squish and stretch. So let's start with fill frame proportionally. Okay? This is going to keep the same proportions. It's going to fill the image in my frame, but parts of the image are going to be clipped off because the image was wider than this particular image. So if, for example, I double-clicked on the image, we could see in this kind of brownish color that my overall image is larger than where my frame is. Right? And I could, for example, move the image over, right, or over the other direction, and it would continue to be clipped by my frame, right, but my image is actually larger than the square that represents my frame. Okay? If instead I select my objects, I right-click, and I go to Fitting, and I say Fit Content Proportionally, right? It's going to make sure that the whole image fits inside my frame. But now I have white space at the top and at the bottom. Okay? So it's a different option in terms of how you're seeing. If I were to double-click on it, I can still move the image around. Right? I can put it at the top or at the bottom. But no matter how I do it, it's not going to fill up the whole frame. Okay? So let's look at one of our next options. If I go to Fitting, and I go to Fit Content to Frame, right? it's going to stretch the image so that the whole image fits inside the square. So double clicking on it, it's exactly the same size as the square now. Right? So I don't have any bit of the image hanging off. Okay? This may or may not be desirable to you. Right? The other thing is if let me back up 2 steps to where I actually had an image that was larger. Right? If I right click and I go to fitting, fit frame to content, it's going to enlarge the content, or excuse me, it's going to enlarge the frame to include the whole image. Right? So the whole frame got bigger in that context, which again may or may not be valuable either. Okay? So let me back up. So in all reality, right, I'm probably mostly going to go to fitting fill frame proportionally. That's the most common one, which is why it's first. Okay? So once again, I want to adjust the composition here. We'll move this over a little bit, something like that. Right? And so now I have an image that is my backdrop, and I need to add some text. Right? So let me go ahead and I'll go to the text tool here. Right? And the way text works in InDesign is I need to actually create a text box, right, where the text is going to go. So I'm going to click and drag to create a box, and then I can type right in here. So if it's Garth Brooks, right, I would type that in. Right? You guys probably can't see that because it's black right now on the kind of grayscale background. So maybe I need to switch the color. Right? So I'm going to select the text, and I'll come over here to my tools, and I'll look, and we can see right here where there used to be just a square with a red slash in it. I now have a T that's black. And below that, I have a slash that is in the outline of the T. So I want to change the color of the text. I'll double-click on the T, and it brings up this color picker, which is, again, in CMYK values. Right? Right now, K is 100, so I have just black. Right? I want it to be white, so I'll pull the mouse all the way up into this corner, which is where white is. And I also have to pull this slider up until I get to white. Okay, so it's upper corner plus there, or I could do 0, 0, 0, 0. I'll say OK, and now, right, you can probably see Garth Brooks written. Okay, now my font isn't big enough yet, and it may not be the right font. So if I were to select it, I can go and look at this upper ribbon up here, and I can do a couple things. One, I can choose the justification of the text. So we'll say it's center justified, for example. Right? Or right justified, depending on what my goal is. Right? I can also change the size. So right now it's at 12 point. We can bump it up. Right? Maybe that was too big. I can use the arrows, customize it a bit. Right? Maybe it's something like that. Whatever looks or feels about right. Again, trust your intuition here. Okay? I can also change the font. Right? I can pick a different font. Right? That may or may not be my desired font for this, but the point is you can play around and pick something that feels right to you. Whatever. Right? And now, right, I have this particular text box with my font in it. Right? I can shrink this box down a little bit so that it looks to be about the same size as the actual text. Right? Just by using the grips. And then I can move it to whatever feels right. Right? Now, the other thing that may happen in your particular album, right, whatever it is, I should give this album a name or whatever too, but you may want to get the logo of your band, right? And so we can go back again, and I'll do an image search on Google this time. And so maybe I'll do Garth Brooks logo. Right? And there's a bunch of Garth Brooks logos that are out there. Okay? And so maybe, that one's decent or this one's decent, right? There's lots of different ones. Right? Let's take this one. Let me view the image. Okay, it's reasonable. I'm going to go ahead and save this image as, and I'm going to save it to my flash drive. And we'll go into my Dropbox, and we'll go here, and I'll go ahead and paste it. Oops, never mind. I just want to save it. Okay, so now if I went to File and then Place, and I picked on this image and went Open, I could stick it in, right? Or, remember, I can create the box for it first, and then place it into that frame. Okay, it's too big. Right-click, Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally, right? And there it is. Okay. Now, to me, that is rather ugly, right? So this is where maybe some Photoshop post-processing would be nice. So, and I'm encouraging you to not forget about Photoshop by doing this, right? So let me go ahead and open up Photoshop quickly. And then let me go ahead and open that logo. All right, there it is, right? I'd like the background to become transparent. So let me go ahead and I'm going to right-click and say Duplicate Layer so that I actually have a working piece. And I could, using my selection tools, for example, I could erase, right, everything that's black, right? Or I could switch the blending mode on this layer to multiply. Excuse me, I think it's going to be lightened. But I need, well, never mind, it's not going to do what I want it to. Let me go ahead and just delete the background. It'll be easier. I'm going to go up to Select, wrong program. It's down here, sorry. We go to Select, Color Range. It's a black and white image. I'll just take the black. I'll say OK. Right? And then I'll go ahead and delete the black. And now I have the transparent logo. Okay? Now, when I go to File, Save As, I'm going to save this as a PNG. And I'll go ahead and click Save. It's in the same folder. And I could spend a little bit more time making that look better, but the concept is still there. So let me jump back here to this. Now, if I go to the Links menu, right, we can see that I have two images that are linked in. Right? One is the background image, but the other is the Garth Brooks logo. And it's this JPEG. Okay? If I wanted to replace this image with the one that I just created, the PNG with the transparent background, right, I could come down here, and there's an option for relink. Right? It's a little chain there. And I can go back to my flash drive again. And I could pick this image instead and say Open. And it will replace one for the other. Right? And I did a terrible job isolating that. But you get the idea. Okay? And so I can start to layer this stuff up very, very nicely such that I can create this album cover. Okay? There are, of course, far more options that are out there. So, for example, there's actually an option for blending modes in InDesign, so I wouldn't have to go back to Photoshop and correct it. I could do it in InDesign, but it's a little bit too much for you guys to have right now. What I want you to concentrate on today is being able to create a frame, place an image into that frame, write a little bit of text, change the color of the text, maybe bring in some logos. Sometimes people like to do the parental advisory logos. Right? That's a good little extra piece to add. Right? So you could do an image search for parental advisory. Right? We can get one of these little things. Right? That one's actually kind of fun. We can save that in. And once again, I could create a little frame. Something like that. File, Place. And right-click, Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally. Right? And in my context, I need to move it up here so you can actually see it. And I probably need to adjust the frame so that you can see the whole thing. Okay? So when we're looking at InDesign, right, we end up seeing these little blue boxes, right? And we also are looking at an image, if I were to zoom in, that's a rather pixelated version of this image. Okay? It doesn't mean that the end product is going to be pixelated. It's just giving us a preview of kind of what the image looks like. If I want to see it in a better resolution, I can right-click on it, and I can go to Display Performance, High Quality Display, and that'll change it from being pixelated to being sharp, right? Which can be something that's desirable if you wanted to review what something was looking like. Okay? So again, it's just an option that's available to you. Most of the time, working with the typical display, the pixelated version, helps speed up the computer and make it really fast to work with. And you don't need the full resolution version to get the sense of what the overall image would look like. You would do the post-processing in Photoshop and then update it. Right? The other thing that can happen with the way these links work, if I were to, for example, open up that original image in Photoshop, and I were to say I don't like the sepia tone to it, the brownish tone, I wanted it to be in true black and white, and I went to my layer, new adjustment layer, channel mixer, and I turned it to monochrome, true monochrome. Right? I'm not going to play with the options right now. Right? And I went to File and then Save, and I saved it as a JPEG with the same name. Yes, I want to replace it. Right? That then became a black and white image. If I go back to my InDesign, notice here in the Links menu that I get that little yellow triangle. Right? It means that this file has been updated outside of InDesign. So if I click on the triangle, or double-click on the triangle, it will then update the file that I edited to match. Right? So this is one of the great powers of InDesign, is you can have these files, you can make updates to them, and then your InDesign file with the layout work will just have the newest versions of the files as you go forward. Okay? So I know InDesign is a lot to take in. It looks like a lot of you have already started playing with InDesign, which is good. But at the same time, hopefully we'll get some more technical explanations of things. Okay? Next week, we're going to talk about type and typography, which will get into all the specifics about kerning and tracking. And we'll also deal with certain character and paragraph styles and how you can apply it across a document. So we'll get a lot more about type. And then we'll move back into more advanced InDesign layout stuff. Okay? Any questions? All right.